Professor Lorenz, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with your background, where you started off, the arc of your career so far, and what you're doing now?
Sure. So I got my Ph.D. from the University of Michigan in their Department of Political Science, and then before ending up at Nebraska, did a postdoc at the University of Virginia at their Center for Effective Lawmaking. And then prior to that, before I entered academia, I worked as a lobbyist at the Texas State Legislature.
So you had some real world experience on the local level.
A little bit. There are definitely lots more people with much more experience than I did, but it was definitely very eye-opening for how I think about politics, and it informs a lot of my work in my sort of scholarly pursuits.
Interesting. Well, why don't you talk generally speaking about what are the interests you have in the political science arena? What are the general themes of your work so far?
Sure. So I'm really interested in the interactions between individual actors' priorities and the institutions of Congress and other policy-making bodies. So that often manifests in looking at under what kinds of interest groups or coalitions of interest groups are impactful on what Congress does, or it can manifest as the priorities of individual legislators and how they advance them through the legislative process and sort of what makes them better at it or worse. And then ultimately how Congress as an institution selects its issue priorities. And of course, the relationship between all of those things.
Great. Well, I know you've done a lot of work on this area of this special interests and their ideologies and how that kind of feeds into Congress, right? So can you talk a little bit about that project? What questions were you asking and what did you find from your work?
Sure. So first, there's been a long-running sort of discussion in the field of political science about the relationship between the resources of different interest groups and the outcomes that those groups are able to achieve. This is where a little bit of my background comes into play, because I worked for a lobbying firm and we had some money, but we didn't have a lot to throw around, and yet we were still pretty effective at what we wanted to do. So one of the sort of the big questions that I came into academia with was, well, so then what is it about lobbying that's influential? And so I've sort of pursued that on two different tracks. So one, in some of my co-authored work with Jesse Crossan and Xander Furness, we've looked at the ideology of organized interests. We have a new measure of that, and we've been able to identify polarization in the interest group community, and we're working on a project now about how that aligns with polarization in Congress itself. And then I have a sort of a work coming out of my dissertation project, which looks at what are the attributes of lobbying coalitions that it seems to help them have an impact on Congress's legislative agenda.
So for the piece about the ideology, can you talk about that work? What did you find? Is it that highly ideologically driven organizations, are they going after everybody? Are they only going after the faithful in Congress? Do they get anything done? What did you collect and what did you find?
Sure. So we use a technique called ideal point estimation, which ironically, given my professorial role, is actually based on techniques for assessing the difficulty of exam questions. To come up with an ideological point estimate for interest groups and members of Congress on the same scale using their public positions on congressional legislation. So the way this works is that we have a giant matrix of interest groups' positions on bills, and of course every roll call that members of Congress have taken over the same period, and that allows us to sort of to come up with a relative measure of, say, how much more conservative, say, my state's junior senator Ben Sasse is than like the NRA or a group like that. So it uses interest groups' public positions on bills and how those relate to each other to come up with a summary measure of their relative liberal or conservativeness. The key findings there are that, we've traditionally thought of interest groups as these kinds of, the phrase is special interests, right? And that implies kind of a parochialness, where interest groups have a narrow interest where they are partnering with legislators on kind of a case-by-case basis, based on the shared priorities or something like that. And our work suggests actually that interest groups are starting to behave more ideologically than that sort of classic depiction would have us believe. So we observe polarization in the interest group community based on these ideal point estimates. It is not as severe as polarization in congressional roll call voting, but it's still very distinctive. We found we're then able to connect groups with sort of their ideological standpoint with various resources that they might undertake to see like which ends of the ideological spectrum have different types of resources. And the short version there is that interest groups that are on the right tend to have higher resource levels across the board, and it's not close. The other sort of interesting finding there is that the groups that are more active in taking public positions are often like more polarized than groups that are kind of in the middle. So the groups that take the most positions are also the most polarized in our data.
So how did you build the data set? Is it you had to go to each group and then score them on a subjective basis? I mean, that seems like a lot of data, a lot of work, and a lot of potentially subjective judgments.
Yeah, so we rely on a few different data sources in this project. For the specific, for our first publication in this, we use exclusively data collected by a transparency organization called MapLight, which looks for interest groups stating public, it's not really public like broadcasts, but sort of publicly findable positions on bills and things like press releases. Sometimes they'll show up in congressional testimony. They could be in an open letter on behalf of a coalition. They show up in various places. It very rarely is it like it shows up in a news story somewhere. So for this first piece, we relied on that data set, and that was I think 160,000 positions from about 2009 to 2016. So in terms of the subjectivity, there's always, there's in any sort of measurement task, there's always the possibility for error. And a lot of how you guard against that is by, gut checking your data and making sure that the results you get broadly make sense. And if there is a surprise, that you can go back and check the data and make sure that it's there kind of for good reason.
So was it done? Okay, so you got it from a third party. Mm-hmm. But the way that they did it, they would look at these public statements and then connect it to a bill and give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah. So very often interest groups, when they are, they have a lot of incentives to be clear about what they want when they're doing this. If you think of these public statements as an advocacy tool, they need to not leave any doubt about what they would like to see happen. So usually it's they either say we support or oppose this bill, or they are supporting or opposing like the main thing the bill does. And so that way it's like there's still some room for judgment and therefore for error in there, but it's very rarely is it ambiguous. And so you found that the more the more polarized the interest group, the more likely they were to take a position? Yeah, so the most active groups in our data are more polarized than sort of the set of groups as a whole, or they're a particularly polarized subset of the data. And what about reputation? Did you look at, were there more reputable firms also on the polar ends, or the reputable ones all in the middle, and you just had, less reputable ones on the ends? So that's a great question. It depends on what you think reputability means, right? So reputability could be a reputation for being very helpful in the legislative process, right? And that's a big part of the work that I tried to do when I was a lobbyist, right? Was like, as long as you're doing if you're doing what our clients want, right? I'm going to help make sure that you know what you're doing. And that's sort of a potential benefit that lobbying can have in the process. And so there's a reputation for kind of being clear about what that is and transparent, and also being helpful for when legislators are interested in that particular kind of help. I will say that a lot of
within, you can think of interests as falling into broad categories of interest type. So whether they're like a trade association that's representing lots of different firms within an industry, a professional association like the American Medical Association or something like that. You can think about maybe they're a single issue group. So reputation is really an interesting construct. What we find is that within each sort of issue or interest type, that there's a pretty substantial amount of variability in terms of their ideology, but typically they have like kind of a lean one way or the other. Sort of interestingly, trade associations tend to be a little bit more conservative on average than individual firms. Right. So if individual firms are being represented by trade associations, that says something really interesting about what individual firms feel comfortable saying publicly versus what their trade associations are doing.
Might be in the nature of the manager.
Maybe, yeah, that's good. Or maybe they want to make sure that they're appealing to a broad customer base and don't want to be seen as taking positions that are too far to either extreme.
And so you found that when you talk about resources, you're saying that the more polarized, especially on the right, had more resources than the other side. Does that mean money or does that mean something else?
So we looked at it in two ways. So one was campaign contributions. So this is through political action committees that are affiliated with the group, and then through lobbying, like expenditures on lobbying. And in both cases, like, again, it's really not close. When you weight these distributions by the sort of the distribution of organizations' ideology, by their resource levels, there are some minor differences, but really the weight of resources is pretty far on the right.
And were you able to sort of measure if they had any success or impact or
yeah,
what?
so part of our book is going to be looking into sort of the role of interest group ideology and resources and how they change policy making, particularly in this sort of modern partisan Congress. Some of that actually comes into play in my other work, though, where I looked at what are the features of lobbying coalition attributes that make them sort of more or less likely to have bills they support be heard in congressional committees.
Well, I mean, the challenge is a lot of their influence could be, to stop legislation versus put legislation in. So I'm sure it's very difficult to measure the negative, right?
Yeah, so it is. So on the one hand, interest groups are definitely more likely to say, like, we support a bill. Like, there are more supporting positions in our data than opposing positions, but there are still plenty of opposing positions. One of the, I guess you could call it a nice thing about the modern era of partisanship is that people are like not afraid that their position is going to be unpopular as much as we might fear that they would. Right. So the question is, who is your position going to be popular with? And so there's lots of statements of opposition in our data. And so the way I handle this in my original paper is to do essentially like a net measure. So if you compare, say, the campaign contributions of the interest groups lined up in favor of the bill against the campaign contributions of interest groups lined up against the bill, like, how is that difference associated with committee agenda setting?
Why don't we move on to committees then? So I know you've done some work on this whole idea of committee agendas, how they're set and how they prioritize. So can you talk through that work? What questions were you asking? What'd you find?
Sure. So more broadly within political science, there's kind of two ways of thinking about agenda setting. This idea of negative agenda setting, where you keep a bill from advancing further. So this is like if someone is sort of the classic example of this might be the filibuster, where you prevent a bill from getting to the floor that might otherwise pass. Parties, of course, play a really big role in shaping the agenda, especially on the floor. But again, partially coming out of my background here, I tend to take a more positive view of agenda setting. And my sort of mental model of this, the default action on any legislative initiative is nothing. right? And so what makes something on the agenda in that case is that there's like energy behind it, and people are like specifically pushing to make it happen or purposefully selecting it to have happen. So the way that I come about these questions is to think about why would you favor some bills over others, right? So I've looked at that in a couple of different ways. So one is that the person of the committee chair themselves can have a big role. So in my dissertation work, I showed that the issue priorities of committees were dependent on the personal priorities of the chair. And we can show that by looking at what happens when a chair dies suddenly in office or resigns in scandal. And then a new chair comes into place. There's a shift toward the issue priorities of the new chair. And I don't think very many people would find that super surprising, but it suggests that despite the fact that there's lots of influences on what the chair can do, things coming from party or from reauthorization bills that committee is sort of in charge of, that despite those constraints or those things sort of taking up agenda space, there's still room for chairs to select things that they want. Right. So then the next part of my dissertation work that focused more on the role of interest groups in committee setting says, okay, let's take that and figure out, okay, if I were trying to influence that decision-making process, what is it about bills that committee chairs care about? Right. So the way that committees in Congress work is that subject to pressure from other actors, chairs have a lot of discretion over which bills that have been referred to their committee that they select for hearing. So you'll hear stories about some chairs where they say before they'll even give you the time of day, you have to have at least one sponsor from the majority party before, or one co-sponsor, and they'll just make that a rule. And that's not like a rule that's written down anywhere. It's just like how the chair makes decisions. Or some places, there are some committees that I've heard of that require sort of a sponsor and a co-sponsor from each party. Right. So, and you can imagine that would have a pretty big impact on the kinds of bills that are coming out of that committee.
So you talk about the special interests and their focus on the committee, right? And you're talking about the chairman as being a very important component of this prioritization, if not the core component. So how do they interact with the chairman? How do they get what they want onto the docket?
So in work that comes out of my dissertation, I try to imagine what is it about lobbying coalitions that a committee chair would be interested in. So because my sort of model of agenda setting is one in which there's like lots of stuff that could be on the agenda, and committee chairs are selecting things within, subject to pressures from other say key institutional actors like parties, that they're looking for bills that they have reason to believe will be sort of viable further on in the legislative process. But they can make predictions about that, but they can't observe it perfectly ahead of time. They're essentially making the best guess they can about what bills are going to be viable. So I look at lobbying coalitions of three different types. So the first is like just big coalitions that have lots of like a large number of groups in them. And then second, I look at what people are probably most strongly associated with what makes interest groups influential. I look at campaign contributions from industries lined up for and against the bill. And then lastly, I develop a theoretical logic where a coalition that, regardless of its size, is diverse in the types of interests that are represented among the coalition's members. So like having lots of different industries or lots of different causes or lots of different types of organizations represented, would give the committee chair a clearer signal that downstream, like lots of different types of legislators from lots of different parts of the country, say, or with lots of different types of districts, are going to have reason to support the bill, somewhere among the set of organizations that are lobbying on it. So I use the same data from Maplight to at the bill level to see what are and I can put the sort of coalition size, campaign contributions, and diversity in kind of a head-to-head matchup. And I find that this interest diversity among lobbying coalitions is positively associated with the likelihood that a bill gets attention in committee. So that's either a markup or reported from committee. And that the sort of association for campaign contributions is what we call not statistically significant, and that when you control for these other two attributes, having a large coalition is actually to a certain extent counterproductive. And there's sort of an interesting discussion to have there about like, when you're constructing a lobbying coalition, what is each new member bringing to the table? Because the bigger your coalition gets, the more difficult it is to coordinate.
So what you're saying is that if you control for money, money's not the key thing. It's the diversity of groups that support the bill.
Yeah, so that's what I find.
That's pretty interesting, because I always would assume it wouldn't be money that would be the important thing. It would be the number of voters, right? Because ultimately, if members want to connect with voters, they're going to look for the special interests that can move them in, the most voters, right? And money probably not a good proxy for that in many cases.
Yeah, probably not. So it's interesting that you mentioned voters. This is actually kind of how I think about it also. So when you have, so I mentioned that like you want to give lots of different legislators from lots of different areas of the country that have districts that are often very different from each other. Like give each of them their own reason to like what the bill is going to do, right? And sort of the industries or causes represented by the types of interest groups that are lobbying on the bill can kind of serve as a proxy for that, right? They can say like, okay, say tech is really important in my district, right? I may not like care about everything that's on here, but I can see that the tech groups really like this bill. So all else equal, I'm going to be inclined to support it, right? So a lot of the way that I think about this is that it helps individual legislators connect a bill to their own interests in a more direct way through these organizations that serve as kind of like the representation of these interests.
So what you're saying is it's the diversity is also the driving factor versus the number. So
yeah.
50, interests of the same type.
Yeah.
This is 25 of a wide range. The 25 of a wide range of interests might be more likely to move the bill forward according to the chairman.
Yeah, so that would be an implication of my work. Yeah, and it's sort of interesting. I think oftentimes when you're putting together a lobbying coalition, you're so interested in like gaining traction that like it's sort of like you'll take sort of anyone who comes along and expresses support. But one potential like sort of practical implication of my work is that you should be thoughtful in how you're approaching potential allies, right? And that if someone isn't bringing to the table a new perspective or a perspective that looks unique compared to your other interests or the other members of your coalition, that like you may not be able to say no for other reasons, but from a strategic reason, you should expect less benefit from them than if it was like from a group from a totally different cause.
And it's interesting that the chairman is thinking through this like viability of the bill on the floor or to become law concept himself, rather than talking to the speaker, or the party leadership. I mean, I would think that typically they would be looking to the floor operators to give them insights about whether the bill would pass or not versus the lobbyists.
Yeah. So this isn't to say like my theory isn't that they're asking a random trade association like, hey, is this bill going to advance? It's more like what they see in a diverse lobbying coalition is lots of different reasons why someone might support a bill, right? But that can include party leaders. So there's, of course, party leaders are absolutely central to the modern congressional legislative process. But party leaders are not like, they're not geniuses, they're not omniscient, right? They're also operating under uncertainty, right? So they want to have a clear sense that that a bill is going to gain support at least within the majority party caucus, if not, having the ability to power through the floor. So there's sort of an interesting kind of additional layer of work. It's kind of a future direction that I'm thinking about, is sort of how does the relationship between different agenda setters in Congress sort of shape how different lobbying coalitions and different types of coalitions are valued and interpreted and understood.
So let's talk a little bit more about the agenda setting in the committee, because on the one side you could have a totalitarian kind of chairman, committee chairman who just decides everything. Here's which bills we're going to consider, and here are the hearings we're going to have.
Mhm.
On the other side, you could have a very passive one who just says, okay, if a majority of my committee wants to look at this bill, like if majority of my committee members want to consider the bill, we'll consider it. Or there's a third option, which is everybody on the committee can bring 5 bills to the table.
Yeah.
Right. So how do they figure out which rules they're going to use? I mean, are there standard ones? Does the committee chair just decide what he wants, and every committee is different? How does that work?
So that's a great question, and I don't know that that political science has like a clear. It'd be hard because they don't declare these rules anywhere. These are just sort of how they make decisions. Right? We can't like look up like, okay, in this committee they did this, and this was the effect on the kinds of bills that came out of that committee. We sort of have to infer from the kinds of bills that came out of that committee, what was the chair willing to let onto the agenda. At the end of the day, right, when you think strategically from the chair's perspective, they know that they get to select a bill to put on the committee's agenda, right, for a vote. But they're not going to want to do that for a bill that's just going to get voted down by the committee, right? Or where there isn't a version of the bill that both they would like and that a majority on the committee would support. So, so this is where you get a certain amount of like political deal-making skill becoming really important. So from the chair's perspective, they got to find the best version of the bill from their perspective that like the median member, or at least a majority of committee members would also approve of, right? And that's, this is another area, incidentally, where interest groups can be really important. Because they can usually when a member of Congress selects onto a committee, there are exceptions, and there are some committees that are more valuable than others that are going to be considered more prestigious or more desirable from one standpoint. But oftentimes there is some sort of constituency or district or even personal interests on a committee to which a member like wants to join, right? So so if you have like people who are interested in science and environmental issues on the space science technology committees in Congress, right? Then they're going to develop relationships with the interest groups that lobby bills on that committee frequently, right? So that's another place where we would expect that that interest groups can help members understand the implications of a given bill for their own interest, whether that's supporting, opposing, or wanting to modify the bill in some way.
But it sounds like regardless of what rules are actually played out in committee, the chairman decides.
So the way that I would think about it is that the chairman has a lot of latitude. That doesn't mean that they are like an absolute dictator, right? The constraints on them are more political than they are formal. That being said, there are some things most chairs give, like it's sort of required that you give like the minority party a day to bring in witnesses on a bill, but like how a day gets interpreted, and like to the extent that you call like a 2-hour hearing a day, like a lot of this stuff is there's wiggle room there, and different chairs exercise that ability differently.
When you talk about the lobbyists coming into a committee, are they focused on the chair then, or are they focused on all the members, or do they go to the chair first, and then once it's on the docket, then they try to get into the rest of the members? How does that work? So
I don't know that political science has like a good sort of like, here is the most common sequence, right? That would be a good baseline expectation for all bills. So I can only speak on what would make sense to me. And then like both what I recall from my own lobbying efforts, which is that the chair of the committee to which your bill gets referred is a huge and important person to get support from. Now, the Texas state legislature is different from Congress in some pretty important ways. So like Congress is like the level of party control and party competition is much stronger in Congress than it was in the Texas legislature when I was there. So maybe this would be different. But the way that I think about it is you sort of, you have to get the chair on board in order to get the bill scheduled for a hearing or to generate interest. And then once it looks like that might happen, then you start going around to members of the committee and like getting their temperature, trying to explain the bill to them, making sure that like they've heard your arguments. And then are willing to meet with you again to discuss details or to consider potential amendments to a bill or whatever comes up.
I'm curious, since you have experience in Texas,
Mhm.
is it different when there's the sunset concept? Since Texas, if I recall, has mandatory sunsets.
Mhm. Well, so authorizations and they're called sunset provisions in Texas, and those are huge opportunities for lobbying, right? Because for folks who aren't familiar with this concept, agencies just expire at some point, like they're done, like legally they don't exist. And the way that you change that is by passing a bill that extends the deadline of after which the agency goes away out another, it varies by agency or by program, but let's say it's like 5 years or something like that. And because that agency's reauthorization is then up on the docket, basically, they call them Christmas trees because there's kind of a present for everybody under there. It's like, that this bill is going to get floor time. So the question of whether it's viable or not is it's going to get talked about. So everyone tries to get their amendments, and those bills are often about amending existing programs to make them more to somebody's liking. But Congress has this too, actually. So they don't call them sunset provisions. And when I looked for them as sunset provisions, when I first made the transition from like working in Texas versus like studying Congress, that threw me for a loop for a while. But congressional programs have reauthorization deadlines. There are ways around it. So like if the deadline passes and the agency or the program doesn't have authorization anymore, there's like stuff you can do to like buy more time and things like that. So it's a little bit, there's a little bit more flexibility there, I would say. That's been used by some as an important, like the ability to get reauthorizations done has been used as a measure of congressional capacity and sort of polarization, because there's so much energy, it's considered so likely that some version of the reauthorization bill will pass, that if it doesn't, and they have to kind of go on to these emergency measures, that might suggest that Congress is not able to sort of do its kind of its core legislative duties.
Yeah, the problem is in Congress they're sunsetting, but they still exist because the appropriators still give the money, right?
Yeah, there is more flexibility, and I think my impression is in Texas they at the time that I was there, at least, there were many people who were happy to let a agency or a program they didn't like just expire, and they were not going to get on board with letting those like giving any sort of flexibility.
So I'm curious about your perspective on this notion of interest groups, or I guess lack thereof. Groups of people who don't have a strong lobby. And if you think they're disadvantaged, right? Like for instance, I'm always concerned about the future, right? So future citizens or what have you, they're going to be paying a lot of this debt, but they don't have any people here lobbying to say, don't load up any further on the debt, right? You've only got current people who are current constituents who are pushing for benefits, right? And the same thing for the poor or other groups like that, who aren't able to organize and they don't really have lobbyists. So what is your thought about those groups compared to the groups that do have lobbyists? Are they at a big disadvantage or not?
So I think that the absence of like a lobby for poor people is a problem. It's a significant problem, actually, for ensuring that the interests of low-income folks are represented adequately in Congress. A lot of what Congress does is it's about interest and attention and who can like make it look like whatever they're interested in has momentum at any given time. So I think it's a significant issue that there are sets of interests in society that don't get well represented. And it's interesting to think of sort of like future generations as an interest now, right? In kind of a similar way. I guess I'd be more inclined to focus on folks who are low income right now, because like I can clearly I can map on, what their consideration would be. And there are some political scientists who have done work on that. Most recently, I think would be Christina Miller, who has a wonderful recent book on sort of the organization and lack thereof of folks in low-income areas. So, my work would suggest that not so much that that resources dominate or that activity dominates or doesn't, right? Often I think of things as like, if you're around and there, then people will start talking to you and they will care about what you say. But it suggests that even for groups that don't have resources, there are alternatives, right? So what I'm thinking about, and this goes back to my own experience, like we didn't have a lot of money to throw around at my office, not zero money, but not a lot. And so it's like, what was it that made like our lobbying effective, right? And a lot of times it was because we had an idea. We could clearly define what the problem was. We could clearly show like where that problem was generated by existing state law. And then we had a solution in hand. And it was like often like one that like I or my boss or our client wrote, right? If you're interested in solving this problem, here's a bill that would solve that problem. And so we rely on, there's room in here for legislators' judgment, right? They have to make the trade-offs between what are important problems to solve now versus what are things that we're going to spend money on now that we're going to like pass to future generations, or what are things that we're going to deal with in ways that certain interests like that other interests might not even be aware of or may not be organized enough to sort of counter or to sort of modify a particular bill, say, in order to get their interests better represented. So in my thinking, it's often much more about who's organized and paying attention and active. And then like resource levels is more making a difference on the margins.
Got it. So let's move on to another subject, which is the staffing, because, obviously on the one side, a lot of people talk about this big lobbying effort as a supplement to staff, right? Or a replacement for staff that don't exist. So can you talk about what have you I know you've done some work on staff tenure and the relationship between that and bills, legislative effectiveness, et cetera. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So this was during my postdoc with Craig Volden at the University of Virginia and their Center for Effective Lawmaking. Oftentimes legislators are, obviously it's the legislator who gets elected, but what makes them successful is who they bring around them. There's this metaphor that's been running around political science circles of the legislator as an enterprise, right? Where you can think of staff of a legislator as like the people who are doing a lot of the background work and a lot of the preparation that then gives the legislator space to do all the things that legislators need to do, whether that's out in public, fundraising, anything else, right? So staff play this really important role in helping a member both connect with their constituents, but also to execute their legislative agenda. And so our work looked at specifically at what kinds of policy staffing decisions help legislators advance more bills of greater importance further through the legislative process and into law. So for that, we looked at legislative staff expenditures and members' legislative agendas going back several decades. And what we find is it's not necessarily like spending a lot of money and having a huge staff of policy staffers. It's like having one really, really good one. Who you then like pay a fair amount, like having a really good legislative director, for example, or a really, really good chief of staff who's got a good policy mind, or lots of experience or knows the the players.
It was a star methodology, like the stars moved the thing forward.
Yeah, kind of. It's stars implies that they're well known, and often they're not. Right, but there are people who stick around in Congress for a long time instead of say going through the revolving door and ending up as lobbyists, or quitting legislative politics and going off into business or some other line of work. So like I said, what we find is that that having a good, experienced staffer who's been around for say over a decade. Or longer for that matter, helps a member advance their legislative agenda. And that's particularly true of relatively new members of Congress. So one thing that that we've said when folks have asked us, like, what's the best thing that I can do as a new member of Congress to really like hit the ground running? It's like hire one really good person who has and like let them help you learn how to navigate the internal workings of how Congress's legislative process and everything.
Is that a chief typically, or is it a legislative director, or
it's someone in roles at that level. So there are formal titles and there are like nominal duties associated with each of those formal titles, but much like in committees, individual members have a lot of discretion both about who they hire and what they ask people in different roles to do. So like just saying here's the title of this person is not necessarily a good indicator of like what their day-to-day life looks like. Or maybe there can be multiple people that have the title legislative aide in an office, but they're not all primarily working on legislation.
Well, let's talk about this concept of redistricting. I mean, typically we don't talk about how people get into Congress here, but what happens after they've arrived. But redistricting is a big question. So I know you've done some work on that. What have you found there?
Yeah, so the concern of partisan gerrymandering is very salient for often in sort of like public discussions of how we might reform Congress. And to a certain extent, like, how we select people into Congress really matters for what they do when they get there, right? So if we select only people who are interested in like getting onto cable news, then like that's what we'll get, right? And if our institutions are creating incentives that only allow people who are interested in messaging and people who don't want to do like the hard sort of like drill down work of legislative negotiation, right? That's sort of not glamorous, but it's important. Like how we elect people to Congress can have an effect on the kind of people who get elected and ultimately what Congress does. So lots of different reforms to try to affect redistricting are out there. One thing that's come out as a popular idea for dealing with partisan gerrymandering specifically is something called a redistricting commission. And so there are a few states who have these, a growing number. I think after this legislative cycle, roughly, if I'm remembering my calculation correctly, about a quarter, just under a quarter of members of the House will have been elected from a district drawn by an independent redistricting commission.
And you think that's a better, or how do you feel like that compared to, say, some of the ranked choice voting methodologies?
So I really think of those as accomplishing different things, right? So ranked choice voting and other reforms are really designed, whether they do this effectively is kind of an open question in the field, but they're designed to affect sort of how campaigns operate and how individual voters sort of view their selection criteria. But redistricting, right? So if I create a district that's like, say, super progressive, right? Then I know that like the ranked choice vote, there's like sort of a limit on what ranked choice could do in terms of like shaping who, like the kinds of person who's going to get elected from that district. I should say that like independent redistricting commissions themselves are also, there have been a few states that have done them and they sort of become more popular over time. So there's an ongoing debate in the field about how they affect things like the ideological extremeness of members. My focus has been on, does this sort of like lack of insulation from partisan gerrymandering incentivize members to engage more in the legislative process? And the quick answer is that it's kind of a mixed bag there too. When independent redistricting commissions create competitive districts, members from those competitive districts drawn by an independent redistricting commission tend to have relatively higher legislative effectiveness, is a finding in my current working paper, right? But but there are ways to sort of where there are alternatives that some members have available to them where that incentive doesn't work quite as strong. So like members who are really, who have a lot of seniority, who've been reelected from this district, maybe they have a campaign war chest that's been built up over time where they don't have to worry so much about like, if you move some stuff around their district, they're still going to have a really strong organizational presence in the district that they have. I've also, there's sort of ongoing questions about like, is it when you have an independent redistricting commission, does that change the behavior of people who have been there already, whose district then shifts to an independent redistricting commission, versus once the commission has drawn the lines and you're electing new members? Do those members behave differently than the previous occupiers of their seats were? And that's sort of what I found, is that it's really like new members who are coming from seats drawn by an independent redistricting commission that have this positive association with legislative effectiveness.
Can't have taint of the past.
Well, it's the way that, I mean, I guess the way that I think about it is that, like, we elect people to Congress, right? And people develop habits, or they have quirks of their personality, or just interests that hopefully include lawmaking, but may not. And so it's kind of like, as long as those people are still around, like they're mostly going to continue to be themselves.
Great. Well, with that, I think we need to move on to our round where we talk about questions I ask everybody, so we can later on compare the answers if you're ready to move on to the next phase.
Sure.
First question here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean? Are you is the representative just a window into the beliefs, the current beliefs of the constituents? Are they making Burkean judgments? Where do you come out on that question? Who do they represent in the district? I
think that on most questions, most people don't have the time in their day to develop an understanding of what are the different policy options, right? It's really easy or relatively easy for people to, if the question is like yes or no, right? They can answer that question with pretty effectively with relatively little information, right? But if it's a question of like, here's like 10 different policy options, what's going to be the best way to handle this problem, right? They're going to struggle with that. So the way that I think of representation is about helping members, if it's working well, helping members understand here are the problems that need solving. So I do think it's important to think of representation in terms of like ultimately like the priorities of the institution, right? So Congress should be focusing on the problems that matter to people, right? But like how that works, there are multiple different routes, right? So I think often about organized interest groups, right? So often they are representing sub-constituencies that have a problem that can be addressed through policy. And so the legislator's job then is to weigh those priorities against each other in a way that's transparent enough that then their constituents can make judgments about like, are they prioritizing the right things? Are they going about it in the right way? So there's kind of lots of different thoughts about what's the proper role of interest groups in representation. But I see the primary input of like mass politics citizens as defining here are the problems that need solving. So it sounds like you believe the member needs to make judgments. Yeah, I do. It's necessary, right? It's impossible not to do that. So yeah, exactly. So I don't. There's sort of this ongoing debate in Congress of Congress scholarship about like delegate versus trustee representation, and like pure delegate where like the member is just like conveying what their median legislator wants on things. I don't think that's possible, like realistically. That doesn't mean that you have to go like full what the people want doesn't matter. It's that ultimately there's always going to be room for legislators' individual judgment, and then there has to be enough information for constituents to evaluate whether the legislator has done a good job. And in terms of who the constituents are, is it primary voters? Is it party? Is it everybody in the district? Is it everybody who will ever exist in the district? Where do you come out on that one? So are you talking about like, what is it or what do I think it should be? This is a should question. Okay. So I'm one of these folks who thinks that like, regardless of who elects you, you represent a district, right? And so the way that our institutions were designed was not really well suited for handling like institutionalized parties that ran like primary elections that were the most competitive elections. So that's like an area where our institutions are not well designed to produce the kind of representation that at least I think is important. So I think when you're elected from a district, you represent the whole district, not just the people who elected you, or the people who voted for you, excuse me. Right. So the next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? So one of the big things that's come up relatively recently in congressional history is that when they're in DC, right, which they're only in DC for a few days out of the week, they spend a lot of their time in these like really like dull looking office buildings across the street from the Capitol, dialing random donors doing fundraising work. And of course, all of that's perfectly legal, right? Obviously, the parties have set up these operations in order to not be run afoul of campaign finance laws. But it does mean, you know, I come from a tradition in political science that really values or really pays attention to how members spend their time, right? And if half their time when they're in DC is spent like in a cubicle calling for donations, I don't think that's a good use of their time. And I would rather have them work more on solving particular identified problems or things that Congress has decided this is a problem that we need solving.
So would you move them to DC with families, make them work in the Capitol, can't leave for 2 weeks on end? What would your what would your structure be? Are you a 3 weeks on, 1 week off person? Do you have a sense for how you would break it down?
The 3 weeks on, 1 week off idea is interesting. You know, I try to think about what do I imagine members would accept. And so what I think is more important to me is that when they're in DC, they are in DC doing DC stuff. And when they're at home, they are doing the important work of connecting with their constituencies and doing electoral work. And like you're never going to fully isolate those two different types of operation. But at the end of the day, I don't know that like it needs to be like a particular structure of the calendar so much as like members have time on their schedule to do the really hard work of legislating.
All right, next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? You know, is it on the floor? Is it in committee? Is it in private rooms? Where should this discussion happen?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. You know, my mentor sort of taught me this old adage, which is that hearings and floor debates are kind of show business for ugly people. And I think that's important. Like but what we should look at actual hearings and floor debates as is sort of like the report on the current status of the discussion or the debate that's happening when people can converse with each other in a more free-form manner. By necessity, the way that debates are sort of structured in sort of formal settings in Congress is they have to be like pretty rigid, right? But that doesn't allow for a lot of really effective back and forth. Often because they're publicized, people, you know, they have to feel like they are representing a particular point of view rather than like exploring, like searching for different possible solutions. So what I think should happen, or would be an interesting thing to try, is to formalize the process of forming like working groups, or sometimes they're called like gangs in Congress, to solve like particular problems. So the idea that I kind of had on this, and it's not super well formed yet, is that if you get like majority members of like both chambers in both parties passing a resolution in which they agree that like this thing is a problem that needs solving, then you appoint a bipartisan working group to like work together behind closed doors to come up with a proposal on that thing that everyone in the working group supports. Right now, that would be hard, like especially in a polarized era, like getting there could be very difficult. But then once you have that thing, it has bipartisan buy-in and intercameral buy-in, you could then subject it to the normal legislative process, right? But it'll have this sort of imprimatur of having been crafted by people specifically appointed to come up with a solution that they could all agree on to a problem that Congress has said is a problem. And like that's tricky, right? But when you have a sort of a problem-focused institution, right, what that does is like everybody knows that these 4 members, or however many it is, like these 8 members are the people who are working on international trade or something, you know, or balance of trade issues. That means that all the organized interests who care about that are going to go talk to them. It means all the experts, whether they're scholarly experts or experts who are more from like the business community or have some unique perspective, know like these are the 4 people I need to go talk to. And so it sort of creates a like a forum or like a specific space for people who care about solving that problem to go. And I think actually the current like the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress is a really good example of how this could work. So these are, right, you've created a committee that didn't exist for the purpose of like updating Congress's both like organizational structure, but also like its procedural features and things like that. So the kinds of members who select onto that committee, it's not perfect, but like are going to be people who are more likely to have an interest in that area. And then you attract the attention of outside actors who are interested in helping Congress perform better as an institution. And I think we shouldn't limit that just to congressional reform itself. I think that model could be adapted to solve other problems as well.
Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
So in general, I support efforts to keep staff around longer. So that it would include paying them more would be the obvious one, and making various changes about like the structure of how staff are paid. Staff are important. You mentioned the large amount of work that finds lobbyists are serving as like an adjunct or a supplement to staff, but that works better, I think, if staff are professionalized and they know enough that they can have like a critical dialogue with the different interests that work with them, right? So I want to see a staff that has both political but also technical acumen to a certain extent. They're never going to be as high as like lobbyists and CEOs or experts in a field, but they should have enough that they could have a real sort of critical, potentially disagreement with somebody, right? They should be able to evaluate what someone is saying. So I support those. But more generally, I think that it's important to understand that under any reform, the most interested and the best resource interests are going to win. And there's you can't stop that from happening. That's that's a function of what influence and power is. So then the question is, how do you keep the playing field even, given that you should expect that outcome to be the case, right? So there are a few different ways you can think about doing that. You could think about actively helping less organized interests, right? But that's hard. People have talked about sort of as a professional, there's professional associations of lobbyists, and they've sort of floated this idea of doing more pro bono lobbying, which I think would be interesting. You could imagine more transparency in who legislators choose to meet with, so that members have to know that they have to balance giving attention to different interests. And then sort of the other broad set of things would be about flattening the distinction between winners and losers in terms of outcomes. So even if it is the case that the most well-organized interests are winning, that what it means to win is not as not as huge as it is currently the case. So you could imagine efforts to make sort of policy making be more incremental would kind of have that character.
Some kind of minority rights for less represented interest groups.
Maybe, yeah. So something like that, where you either are actively helping the less organized interests, or you're flattening the distinction between winners and losers.
Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
In terms of lobbying, the reason I went to Michigan was to go work with Rick Hall, who is the lead author on an article called "Lobbying as Legislative Subsidy." And I didn't understand the technical parts of it at all when I wrote it. But when I was applying to grad school while working as a lobbyist, and I read that article, and I was like, this article describes what I do and how it matters. So that article is really important for me in understanding the role and influence that interest groups have in the legislative process. And then on lobbying coalitions specifically, and how to think about the role of interest groups in the process, in the legislative process, which I think is important for any discussion of reform of them. Robin Finney's book, Strange Bedfellows, is sort of, in my mind, kind of the best book-length treatment so far about why is it that diverse lobbying coalitions should matter.
Excellent. Well, last question is really just about your future plans. What do you have, in development, and where do you see your research going in the long run?
Sure. So I've mentioned, I think, a couple of times that I'm working on a book project with Jesse Crossan and Xander Furness, which is taking these ideology scores that we came up with and trying to figure out, are interest groups always polarized? Or is interest group polarization a relatively recent phenomenon? What's the relative time frame for interest group polarization and like partisan polarization in Congress? And how does increasing party competition in Congress affect interest group strategy? So merging the discussion of the interaction between interest groups and parties is, I think, really important for having an understanding of how interest groups influence the legislative process. And that's our book. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, Professor Lorenz, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with your new book, and best of luck to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. This was great.
Thank you.